Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hersko. Joining me once again, I have my fellow collaborators and partners in crime, Mr. Andrew Leff, who's on mute.
What's up?
Mr. Joel Zinstone.
Definitely not on mute.
Definitely not on mute. And Mr. Stephen Kellogg.
Hey, all.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining. So the topic of this week's episode is another in our Metaphors Matter series. If for those of you that haven't caught some of the previous episodes, we've talked about shifting the metaphor that we use in our professional world to stop relying so much on the mechanical and the human engineered and talk more about the biological and biology and the biologically engineered. So this week, we're going to be talking about organizational sickness. And we talked about we're more doctors. If we change the metaphor to be more doctors than mechanics, well, what does that mean for things that we spot inside of organizations, looking at them like organisms? Joel, I'm going to bounce this one over to you real quick to give put a little bit more meat on that bone, because this is genesis from a conversation that we have with John Schneider. So fill us in and give us a little bit more color.
Yeah, so if we're starting to look at organizations as teams, as entire companies, as an organism rather than a machine, which is traditionally how we would view teams and organizations, then we have to start looking at things that go wrong differently, right? Every organization has things that are wrong in them. In fact, I don't know that any of us on this call would have a career in this field if things weren't going wrong in organizations, right? But traditionally, how management and leadership and most of the books and methods, et cetera, out there that would help us try to understand how to navigate and help improve things that are going wrong is very mechanical in nature. We're told, train people on a new way of doing things, be there to tell them when they're getting it wrong, swap out people who aren't working out, et cetera, right? All the way up to the CEO level. Sometimes we say, you know what? And in fact, we as Agilists are pretty famous for this, of saying, you know what? Leadership's the one that's got to go, right? But when we start thinking about a more organic metaphor, and we start thinking about replacing just wholesale replacements of parts of the organization in order to solve problems, whether that's how people are working, whether that's the people themselves, the teams themselves, we know that that's fairly unhealthy, right? You can't just rip out somebody's heart and replace it with another one. In fact, that's kind of a last resort. You really don't want to do that to a patient, right? So we have to start looking at things that go wrong and how to fix them more like diagnosing and treating diseases or injuries or illness like we would if we were treating a human being or another organism, right? Right. And that's kind of where we're going with this tonight is what do those changes look like, and what kind of mental shift do we need to make?
So I'm going to add on to that, and then I'm going to go to Leff with my leadoff question. So to add on to that, if we think about all these parts inside of our organizations, right? If we go away from organization and go to organism, these parts is almost like if you think about the human body, right? You have in our companies, we have legal, we have compliance, we have risk, we have our development teams, we have our business, we have technology. Those things then become your circulatory, your musculature, your bone system, your endocrine system, and that frame of mind where if one piece is unhealthy, it inadvertently affects the other pieces. So it's not just a hot swap. Oh, we'll just swap out everybody in compliance. Like you said, you don't just swap out a heart. The idea of swapping out like the endocrine system, for example, will be completely insane. So thinking about all these things as parts that contribute to a whole and they need to be healthy holistically, I think that kind of changes how we think. So Leff, let me ask you this. Going further down the rabbit hole of this metaphor, if we're looking at organizations like organisms and realizing that all these different pieces are contributing at different varying levels to the success of the organism, how would you define an illness? So if we're thinking about an organizational illness, what would you call an illness? How would you define that under this new paradigm, metaphor, what have you?
Yeah, I might throw a wrench into the conversation, kind of building off of what you were talking about,
All right.
like cardiovascular. And to me, illness is created through different areas, like the pathways that we need to create, like communication. If you have poor communication, what is the symptoms that poor communication creates that then brings in the disease, right? So poor communication could lead to lack of trust, lack of ability to actually, kind of retrospect, lack of ability to be truthful without fear of repercussion, but also have positive intent. So to me, that is a like an illness that creates kind of disease or issues down the road. So that pathway of communication to me is very important when you're talking about, and if we flip it, organizational health, right? What diseases are created when we don't have health in our organization? These are the pathways that we need to either treat those symptoms, we either need to look for a cure, or we need a transplant, like you brought up earlier. Do we need to fire leadership or fire someone else, right? And transplant a new person into that situation to see if that boosts our health. So I love this topic. I think there's just so much here.
So I'm gonna go to Stephen, but I want to go one question further with you left. So if we look at like bad communication as an illness, right, and that sort of thing, sometimes illnesses resolve on their own. Oh, the common cold sores, right, like cuts or bruises. How following this metaphor down the rabbit hole, how do we know that, or can we even know that this illness will resolve itself on its own? How do we diagnose that as a diagnostician? Is there a clear sign, or is it truly just still lick your fingers, stick it up in the air, and judge the wind?
I mean, I think I'll give you the consultant answer, right? It depends, but I think that rings true. Is are we listening to the right signals? Are we looking at the right data? Are we actually using the data that we're learning that, oh, this was a common cold, so we know it's going to pass, right? So we don't over-rotate on it. So I think it's having that emotional intelligence partnered with the data, that is constantly circulating to understand what we're treating, right? And be intentional.
Okay. So Stephen.
Well, I was just going to add on that real quick. I think you can also look at things like leadership, like parents, right? So when your kids are young, they come screaming, "Oh, my stomach hurts. I have a stomach ache." Well, you can go through some common steps of, yeah, well, when's the last time you ate? Well, I didn't eat. I haven't eaten for 12 hours. Well, it's probably not a stomach ache. You're probably hungry, right? So there's some stuff there. But then at some point, the parent says, wait, there's an issue here that's not a common issue. So let me bring in a consultant called a doctor, right? So I think having that wisdom at the leadership level can help to say, yeah, this is just a cold sore. It'll sort itself out if you let it. Versus, okay, this is probably a time we should actually bring in a consultant.
So I'm gonna ask you another question along those lines, Stephen, and it jumps off what Lef just said. The idea of an illness, sometimes they're self-healing. Sometimes they just go away on their own. Let's talk about self-diagnosis. When should a company self-diagnose versus when should they go to the doctor? Because we all know, like, the worst thing you could do in life is go to WebMD and enter headache, because at that point you have glioblastoma in 3 hours to live. But I mean, and the other side of that is you enter headache and it tells you, oh, drink more water, and it could be the glioblastoma. So again, if we're looking at organizations like organisms, at what point do you quit with the self-diagnosing and find a professional?
I think I'll give you the consulting answer. It depends.
2 for 2.
I do think part of that, though, is just based on experience, right? And that's why it is important to have peers you can talk to. And that's why it's important to have, professional relationships you can lean on to say, hey, this is what's happening. I had somebody call me today to say, I just need to bounce this off of somebody. All right, let's talk. Right. So having those kind of relationships, it's the same thing when you're a new parent. Who do you call? You call your parents and say, this is happening. I think maybe I should take him to the doctor. No, don't worry about it. Just do this. Oh, okay, thanks. Right. So I think it's all a learning process, and it depends on, in some parts, the maturity of the business and the leadership to look at that.
Yeah, and I think to yes, and that I think also we should inspire that level of curiosity, right? If you're actually doing research, you're actually bothered by something. So, if we kind of partner that with, and I have coaching hours every week, no one attends, right? So what is it about this? Hey, I need to self-diagnose, I need to do research. Let me bring that to somebody that can help me decipher it, or help me look at those symptoms and say, here's, as an expert, I hate that word, but as an expert, right? Or somebody knowledgeable with wisdom and all this other experience, this is what I see. Let me read the chart and let's look at your research, yada, yada, yada. So I think, it could help support kind of where there's fatigue around, whether it's coaching hours, lean coffees, just these kind of open space type experiences. It gives people, hey, I'm going to go to the Minute Clinic, right? I'm going to go to urgent care.
Agile urgent care, by the way, if we see that trademarked by anyone, our lawyers are coming after you. But Joel, continue.
So Jay, I think one of the really interesting things as we're talking about this is with our bodies, when we have disease, anytime we have any disease or illness or injury, we know that there's some kind of a long-term impact of that, right? Now, maybe not like the common cold, but for anything that's serious enough to go to the doctor, usually that's you're going to have some form of loss as a result of that, right? And I think a lot of times when we're brought in as coaches to organizations, there's this assumption that regardless of what's happened in the past, regardless of what injury or illness or sickness an organization has, that we'll be able to get them back to peak shape, right? But we know that if we were retrofitting an engine, that might be true, right? We might be able to get an organization back to tip-top shape. But when we're talking about a organic body, there are things that happen that cause permanent loss of something, right? Whether it's like if we're talking about an injury, I have an injury in my shoulder that dates back to high school, and there are certain things I just can't do with it anymore. No physical therapist is ever going to be able to help that, no surgery is ever going to regain 100% of that function, right? The lifelong smokers are a great example. Like every time you puff on a cigarette, you're losing some portion of your lung capacity that no doctor can ever bring back for you, right? So I think when we're talking about these things, organizations and as part of the shift have to understand that their unhealthy habits, their lack of treatment for diseases or bad treatment for diseases that they have, et cetera, may cause damage that can't ever be undone entirely, right?
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because you gave me the segue into the next part, which I was going to start with you. So if we've talked about illness, right? And in organization parlance, an illness is a behavior or an action that has a potential to result in damaging outcomes, right? So that's a potential. So Joel, now build on that metaphor and compare and contrast an illness versus an injury, right? So you just were starting to talk about an injury, right? Like I have a pinched nerve in my shoulder. It acts up once a year. I walk around kind of like lopsided until it goes away. And like you said, I will never get that function back. No doctor can fix it. It's not worth going in there with a rotoscope and chipping away and stuff. So what is if we're looking at an organization, how do I change my brain to think, is this an illness or an injury? How do I even define the difference between the two to start?
So when we're talking about illnesses, usually if we're talking about illnesses, we're talking about some kind of internal illness in our body, right? We're usually talking about something bad happening with our systems, something bad happening with either from an external source, maybe a virus or a bacteria or something like that, or even substance abuse, unhealthy lifestyles. Something has caused some internal damage to our systems, right? Injuries tend to be something that is caused by an interaction between us and some kind of an external force, right? I've been watching way too much NCIS lately, so I see a lot of injuries. Injuries are almost always somebody getting hit upside the head by a 2x4 or something like that, right? So if we think about the difference between injuries and diseases, injuries tend to be something that it's fairly easy to identify the root cause of, something very defined. An injury might be like my shoulder carrying a backpack with 5,000 pounds of books on it for 4 years, right? That even though that was a repetitive motion, that motion caused my injury, right? However, that motion or any kind of motion didn't cause me to get COVID last month. Right. That's a disease that in this case I caught from somebody else. My husband, who thank God he brought that home, But anyways,
now you got it over with.
Now got it over with. But that's a fundamentally different sort of thing. An injury is generally a result of something that I did. A disease is a result of or that somebody did to me. A disease tends to be a result of an interaction with something. Now, that said, when we're looking out at medical definitions of these things, there are medical definitions, and nobody that I've ever talked to uses them consistently. So
right.
So I think we're in a little bit of like metaphor magic here, right?
right. So when you brought up the idea of an injury, I automatically here's where my mind went. My mind went to things like, to put it in context of what we do day to day, dealing in the organizations we work in, injury to me would be something like local optimization, right? So it's happened, it's there, you've seen it. This is the bum shoulder. I know that The more I try and play basketball without getting this shoulder fixed, it's only going to get worse and worse. Local optimization. I know that if I've optimized for Steven's team to the detriment of the rest of the teams, to the Joel team, Jay team, and Andrew team, I know that the longer that goes on, the longer that's going to be. It's not going to be something as simple as, okay, well, we'll just go for scoping or get a cortisone shot. And is a cortisone shot hiring one of the big 4 consulting firms? Don't answer that. We'll keep going. But an injury is, again, local optimization, or making a short-sighted decision knowing that it's going to cause maleffect later, but
you mean like pretending that you're in college and going out drinking?
yeah. Trying to act like you're 22 again when you're 42. It doesn't have the same ring. So, Stephen, what do you think? Like when we're thinking about some of the organizations you come across, right, and the idea of an injury, what are some other examples besides the local optimization I throw off? What do you think are other examples of things where it's damage that's been sustained that's only going to get worse if you don't do anything to mitigate it?
That's interesting. It's interesting in that there, I think, are a couple of different things that happen when you get an injury, right? It's assessed. You then have to determine you're actually going to do what was recommended and sustain it in order for it to get better, right? What often happens is I go to my doctor, they say you're overweight. I say, yes, I know. I worked on it for 30 days. I get tired. I'm still fat. So you know, that's in my own personal
Mhm.
business. I'm not doing what was recommended. So if you have an injury, like you were saying, if you have an injury and you don't treat it properly, you don't get the help when you need, it takes longer to heal it. That does mean your business is suffering in case, since, you know, we're talking about the business, your business is suffering while that's happening. And hiring a consultant doesn't typically mean in 2 weeks you're back up to full par, right? So
Right.
the the flip side, I think, is knowing the injuries as well, right? So if I get a splinter in my foot and I hire a consultant who comes in and screams, "You got to cut your foot off," that's not going to help either, right? They're doing more damage than good. So this is the framework you have to use. Why? Because it's the one I know.
There you
This
go.
is what everybody has to use to fix
There
the
you go.
splinter in the foot, right?
Or Stephen, how about this? How about this for a metaphor for that? You got a splinter in your foot, and the consultant comes in, or the doctor comes in and says, "You need to learn a whole new way of walking just because you have a splinter."
Oh, man, we're uncovering all sorts of uncomfortable parts here. Yep. When you change the metaphor, you change how you view what you're doing, and it really does make you really rethink. No, that's a good point, Steve. It's a good point. You know, don't cut the foot off for the sake of the splinter. Lef, what do you think on the topic of injuries, organizational injury? What do you think?
Yeah, I kind of went similar to where you were going, Jay, or where you went in regards to capacity planning popped into my head, right? If you choose not to do capacity planning as a team or as an organization, what are you injuring, right? You lessen your visibility, and this is a very, you know, finite kind of view, but, you know, to me, that's an injury to the organization. When you don't do certain things, you're injuring kind of what we're trying to do. If you don't test, right? Like if you don't understand how to test, you're not incorporating test cases, you're not looking at testing differently, right? Quality is an injury to the organization, right? That can become disease, or it can become, you know, a way that creates some sort of illness in the organization when you're constantly creating. And I think it was you, Joel, that you said like dropping the new engine in, but we're not looking for high performance, right? High performance takes a lot of maintenance to maintain. What is sustainable? And when we talk about injury, the rehab, right? Are you willing to put in the work to rehab that injury and continue to do the physical therapy it takes to rehab and get as close as you can to where you were, knowing that you'll probably never get there?
Well,
so having that resilience.
And a lot of that left kind of depends on what part of the organism's life cycle they're in too, right? I mean, for organizations that are older, more mature, more well established, injuries can cause a grave loss of function that you can't get back.
Right. The broken hip as the 60-year-old versus the broken hip as the 16-year-old who fell off a motorcycle or
exactly. Exactly. And we've seen that, right? I mean, Google and Facebook in their early years made some various missteps they were able to recover from fairly easily, right? Things that that when Microsoft came along and made similar missteps, they couldn't recover from, right? So good example, Google developing a smartphone, right, alongside the iPhone, right? They had a huge setback by trying to release a phone before they took over Android and all that, right? And were completely outcompeted by Apple when they released the first iPhone. They had to go back to scratch. The story is well known. You guys know it.
Yeah.
Windows tried the same thing, and it was completely fatal for that area of the business, right?
That's a good analogy. It really is.
Like they were a more established, more mature company by all rights, by all conventional logic. They should have been able to throw enough resources at it to get that working, get it working well, and save that area of their business, right? They weren't able to, while Google was. And I think that's a classic example of, now the analysts would probably say something differently, but I think it's a potential example of a difference in place and life cycle, right? Google was a much younger, much more nimble, much healthier company.
Resilient.
Microsoft was resilient. Yep.
Yep.
Microsoft was bloated, old, fat,
Yeah, my blown out ankle being obese is a lot harder to deal with than when I was skinny and 16. Right?
Exactly.
Right. So we've talked about illness. We've talked about injury. I'm going to start with you, Stephen. Under the rubric of under the context of organizational sickness as a metaphor, how would you define inside an organization a disease?
So I think disease can come about if you are not continuing to maintain and grow and be flexible. I think that's one way disease. So in the body perspective, if you're not exercising, if you're not eating right, if you're not, looking at your environment and making sure you're not climbing a cliff when you're 97, although I'm sure somewhere there's a 97-year-old saying, I can climb that cliff. But those types of things can cause disease. And if you're not doing health checks of the business, disease can come about. So I would use those same kind of metaphors for the business side. If you're getting old, stale, fat, weak, you're less likely to survive the long run.
Okay.
So can I poke at you there, Stephen, for
Sure.
something that you said there? I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. You said if you're not doing some of these healthy things and kind of these lifestyle things, it can evolve into disease. Like that's a pretty well-established concept in medicine. I mean, our doctors yell at us about that sort of thing all the time.
Sure.
Could you maybe unpack that a little bit about healthy habits or healthy lifestyles being a root cause of a lot of what we see as diseases in organizations?
Yeah, I mean, the first one to me that popped in mind is businesses that went out of business when the pandemic hit, because their actual IT systems weren't flexible and set up and had the right health checks to say, oh, we need to be able to support people remotely. They couldn't do it.
So like sclerotic arteries.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be, that's the one that popped in mind.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What do you think, Lef? Disease in the organization.
Yeah. I also think of it as, are we paying attention to hygiene? Right. And those, again, the things that we need to do to support the being able to fight disease, right? The antibodies we need to have in our system. So, if you get a cut, like a deep cut, are you cleaning it? Are you doing proper wound care to ward off disease? And if you do you have enough antibodies built, similar to what all of you are talking about is, do we have enough antibodies in our system, right? Not as individuals, but as an organization to fight disease? And how much attention and energy do we need to invest, right, of these organisms or these antibodies to actually, do we have the energy to be consistent, to continue to fight what is important, right? Or what is just going to heal on its own? So that's kind of the way that what's popping up for me when you ask about that, when you ask that question.
Okay.
Dad joke here. So we need to be taking a culture of our culture, right?
Exactly.
That's what I thought of when you said antibodies, right?
Right.
That culture is a big part of that, right? So if you have a terrible culture, that's going to get disgruntled employees. They're going to start feeding on that same, mistrust of the company and the anger or the frustration or all of that. And then next thing you know, you've got cancer in the company. You got to figure out how to deal with it.
And this you're speaking to a guy who, I am 45 and I have literally gotten 5 tetanus boosters in my life. I average every 7 years, I find a way to either step on a nail or run my arm down some rusty piece of metal. Like, Left talked about the cut that you got to keep clean. I'm like, I just,
so an injury,
45-year-old,
that
I'm literally
could
getting
turn into
shot.
disease then.
Yes. But to Stephen's point, though, and almost kind of flipping that on its side, right? So he talked about cancer. Cellular apoptosis is the voluntary death of a cell, right? So there are times, and this came up in Lucifer Principle, comes up in a lot of different medical texts where it talks about how there are parts of the body where the body will voluntarily kill off cells, right? Like, so your skin, what is it? Every 7 years, you literally are wearing brand new skin because all of your skill cells have been replaced. So with that idea of apoptosis and even cancer. So cancer is a result of apoptosis that does not trigger. So cells start to recreate and they start to multiply, and the body, for whatever reason, fails to send the signal to stop, and it grows and metastasizes, right? So there's a whole, we could do a whole episode on the idea of organizational cancer, right? Like bad decisions that have just gone metastatic, right? Wrong leadership, bad process, investing in the Google phone. But the other side of that, which I'm wondering if there's an analogy for what we deal with, not apoptosis that fails to trigger, but apoptosis that functions on its own when it shouldn't be. So for example, Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is cellular apoptosis in the brain, where the brain connections and the neurons start to decay. And for no reason, the body's not telling them to, be the lemming. It just happens. Joel, what's the equivalent of that inside of an organization? Apoptosis where it's run amok.
So I want to back up real quick back to our idea of disease here, because I think apoptosis and Alzheimer's and cancers are we're given a lot of examples here, but something that all these things have in common is they have a name, they have a set of diagnostic criteria, right? You can't just say, Jay, you have cancer and not be able to prove diagnostically that you have cancer, right? Or Alzheimer's or anything else, right? So when we're talking about things like organizational diseases and Alzheimer's, one of the things that we don't really have in our line of work is a guidebook of known diseases with the diagnostics attached with them and potential treatments where we know them and where they exist, right? So I want to make that clear that when we're talking through what might be the equivalent of Alzheimer's in an organization, we don't have so in mental health, they have the DSM-5, which is literally the Bible of diagnostics, where you can go through and look at the differential diagnoses for every single disorder or disease that the person might have mentally, right? Including Alzheimer's. In fact, I was browsing through it before we started on this just to kind of get my brain thinking in this way. And it gives practitioners, people who are trained and can do this, the right tools to say, all right, patient X, you have Alzheimer's. This is the treatments that we can try. Here's the prognosis, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have that in our profession. We've got a whole lot of ideas, and we've got a crap ton of treatments, right?
So I don't mean to interrupt you, but let me jump on that, and then I'm going to throw it to Lep. So we don't have the equivalent of a DSM-5 in what we do with organizations. And I dare say that's probably because the equivalent would be in Lef, as someone who spent a chunk of his life as a consultant. Do we not have the DSM-5 because every different consulting company, nay doctor, nay hospital, keeps all that knowledge and experience under wraps and branded, and they don't collaborate like doctors and hospitals typically do, where they write white papers and they kind of share the knowledge of, hey, I was with this patient and it did this, so you might want to look for that. Is that part of the problem? Because in the rush to monetization, in the rush to create a product that you could resell, we've actually set medicine, agile practice, consulting back because we don't share. What do you think?
I think it's interesting, and I want to go back to the smoking.
Okay.
Use of the smoking. It's the way I'm going to answer your question or kind of build upon it is, I think no one cares, right? You have a company that's successful. Like, why are you, you're changing certain things for what? At the end of the day, that one person that has smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day and has lived till their 90s has debunked that change needs to happen, right? Well, I smoked for 2 packs a day for X amount of years and I'm perfectly fine, right? So that one person can completely unravel the health aspect of things. And I think that that's a challenge, right? Like, to me, when you have these companies that just what is it that they're so resistant to some of this? It's capex and opex, right? Why are we lying? Why are we hiding? That's what it boils down to.
A
So
fundamentally unhealthy lifestyle, you're saying? Like,
yes.
That's a metaphor for you.
We're addicted to sugar and are surprised when all of our companies have diabetes.
But to that point, right? To your point about age and to your point about life cycle, when you're young, you can get away with drinking and eating like shit and getting 3 hours sleep and partying on the weekends, right? Young companies were more resilient. But as time goes on, you can't keep doing what you were doing before. And maybe some of these companies, they tried it. They know what they're doing now is bad, but when we grow up, we'll grow out of it. And then they don't grow out of it. Right. And then you basically
and then you're Blockbuster.
Yeah.
You're Blockbuster, right?
Yeah, your Kodak, your Blockbuster, your yeah.
So one more add-on to your apoptosis thing. An interesting piece on that is, in some ways, that's what a retrospective does. So you are continuing to shed the old cells that are not needed anymore if you're doing them properly and following through with it, right?
That's an interesting way to put it. Yeah. So the lack of a retro is almost like you're metastasizing what could be a cancer, right? Because you're not looking at what needs to be replaced and shed and what needs to be turned off. Interesting.
Yeah. Or what needs to be turned on at that point, right? Because
there was brilliance just about to come out of Joel's mouth. He froze.
Because
oh no!
You
am I back now?
Back.
Yeah, you're back.
You're back. Okay. Well, and the reverse, right? So retros serve as one half of them is to figure out what you're going to stop. The other half is to figure out what you're going to start, right? So it's a little bit of both, and I'm going to butcher the terms here, but the apoptosis and the reverse, figure out when we do need to replicate, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is a health check of going to the doctors and saying, well, based on what you've been doing, based on our recommendations, this looks to be working. Let's continue doing that, right? This doesn't. Okay, now let's introduce this new thing.
But isn't it very human nature, right? Like you build up this fear, right? Like if you think there's something wrong with you, you automatically go to the extreme. And we talked about it earlier. Do you think as soon as you get that relief that, oh, it's just this, you snap back, right? Like you completely gone away from all this thing that you thought you would have to do to stay healthy or treat whatever. And then you're completely snapped back into the spot you were before you even thought about that or even experienced it. So I think there's something there too, that snap back of, well, do we need to focus on this? Is it really important? Because we're able to move forward and it's really not that big of a deal.
So I think there's something like there as well. It's kind of like the mindset piece when people say, oh, it's not a diet. It's a lifestyle, change, right? If you really want it to stick, it's a lifestyle change. Are you willing to make that change? Or do you want to just do something for 30 days and say, yeah, I tried, it didn't work?
So Lef, I think this is where we can actually empathize pretty heavily with our medical peers, because we both face the same thing. Ultimately, we can't fix organisms, right? Just like doctors can't fix us. They can tell us, they can make recommendations, they can be there to support our journey. The most expensive doctors can literally be there for us every day. What they can't do is make us get on a treadmill and walk for 30 minutes a day. Right. And so there's some element, I think, that you're picking up here on that is our responsibility in diagnosing and treating diseases only works insofar as the patient has given us consent and the patient is willing to follow through and act on those recommendations and actually see them through, right? And even then, it's not a guarantee, right? We know that treatments for cancer, for instance, there is no slam dunk treatment for any cancer that I'm aware of, right? There's no slam dunk, and there's no treatment for the common cold, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. This comedian said this, probably 15 years ago when I heard it. It's called a practice for a reason, right? Doctors practice, right? So why is the coaching aspect of what we do not looked at in the same way, right? Like we should be able to have some sort of contract or agreement. I hate the word contract too, but agreement to say that you're under our care, right? Here's your diagnosis, here's your prescriptions, here's your medications, here's your physical therapy, here's all your things, your nutrition, all the things you need to do to focus on these 5 things, right? Mm-hmm. And it's up to you, right? We'll continue to coach you. We'll help you call the plays. We'll help you, monitor, meter, inspect, adapt, all those things, but you have to do the work. So it's same with the patient, doctor-patient relationship. We as patients have to do the work.
Yeah, there's another interesting piece on that too, which is when you go to your doctor, one of the things they ask you is, what other medication are you on? Right? We never get to that. What other consultants are you working with? Right? So I'm hitting that now, looking at enterprise data architecture at a company and finding out that, each department has been working with different consultants to do what they need for their piece. Well, if nobody's pulling all those together to look at the overall picture, you could
much
have
like
pretty
mixing
big
medicines. Yeah, much like mixing medicines, you could actually exacerbate the exact problem you are trying to prevent.
Right.
And that sparked another thought there. I personally know leaders who have gone around to different coaches and gone to them with the same problem, trying to find the one that's going to give them the answer they want to hear. And people do that with doctors all
shopping
the time,
doctors, right? Yeah. So let me throw out an open question, and first person who's got an idea, answer this. So we've talked about illness, we've talked about injury, we've talked about disease, we've talked about all this sort of fun stuff. We've talked about apoptosis and cancer of the brain, and don't go to WebMD for glioblastoma. What is the equivalent of the immune system? If we're looking at organizations and we're treating them like organisms, right? What is the equivalent of the immune system?
Auditing and compliance.
See, that was where I first went, but I'm not sure if that's really it. I don't know.
I'll sorry to jump in, but I think the immune system is the healthy things. I can't get the pathways thought out of my head, but having those healthy pathways, that becomes your immune system to fight off the desire to snap back into whether old habits or new things that just don't align towards that. And those building and structuring a new culture or evolving the culture to have more of that embedded as, the immune system. Gosh, what an amazing experiment that would be.
So I think
I was actually leaning towards culture being the immune system.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I do think, though, one of the traps that we have to avoid, Jay, when we talk about all this stuff is we have to avoid the trap of looking for a one-to-one comparison on all the different functions and parts of the body, right? Not that it isn't helpful for an illustrative point, right? But if we look at our anatomy versus the anatomy of a deep sea octopus, they're going to look fundamentally differently. Different species of organisms are going to look different, right? And while, they probably all have some form of immune system, how that works and the intricacies of it are all going to be different depending on how they evolved and even what their survival strategies are, right?
Right. I think, and to your point, with all these organisms being different, I think the biggest thing that comes away from me when I think about these metaphors is, and I know we have the root cause problem coming up. That's an episode you're gonna unpack about how we end up in what you call the root cause loop. But I think the biggest thing that comes away with me when I think about this metaphor is the idea of a combination of doctors, homeopaths, trying to come up with a holistic treatment, right? You don't just treat the symptom, You don't just treat the disease, it's a whole body wellness, right? So, and to your point, to your left's point about, we're practicing and we're inviting you into our practice. While we're changing one thing over here in where the illness might be, we also need to be cognizant of what's going on in the body overall, because we may, by fixing one thing, kind of weaken another, right? It's like the old, my dogs, when they used to do knee replacement on dogs, they would do the one knee and they would tell you 6 months later, you're doing the other knee because you overcompensate by putting the other, we don't want to create that overcompensation where the company, in trying to overcompensate for something that we're trying to fix, actually blows something out even worse. And usually that second knee is much more painful and a much longer recoup time. So the idea of that, you need to look at it holistically and make sure you are trying to solve for the entire body and the mind, right? Yeah. Because we're not even talking about that. The body and the mind are part and parcel.
I think there's another piece on that, which is, as a consultant or as an internal person, knowing what your specialties are. Are you a general practitioner who can help with kind of the basics? But hey, if there's really something wrong with your eyes, I need to send you elsewhere. If there's really something wrong with your heart, I need to send you elsewhere, or I need to pull in this other consultant specific to that, right? So I think we miss out a lot because consultants jump in and they feel like they have to know all the answers for everything. And that's detrimental as well.
Or as coaches, right? Like, oh, well, I don't know. I don't do ear, nose, and throat. I do digestive, but let me get Left, who does ear, nose, and throat, is the equivalent of me saying, you know what? I'm not a DevOps guy. I don't do XP and technical practices, but Steven is. So let me grab Dr. Kellogg, who knows XP and DevOps, and have him help, and that's part of a brutal pride on our part, right? Like, not having the I hate to say safety, but the safety to admit and say, yeah, I don't know this, but I'm going to grab a doctor who does, because this is their thing.
But do you know why they do that, Jay? They do that because
doctors or coaches?
Coaches.
Oh, okay.
Coaches feel like we have to know all that because when we're talking about what we do in a healthcare perspective, our patients are going to be looking for the lowest cost, right? Because there is no safety net. There is no insurance plan that's going to get them whatever care that they need with the right person, right? So they want to know, they want to find the unicorns. They want to find the amazing doctors that can solve all their problems. They want the silver bullets. They want the shamans, right? Because
they want Uncle Left's special tincture, which is like half morphine, half cocaine, and half like, what's arsenic. And
Served in a tennis shoe.
Yeah, you'll feel better. You'll feel better for a short term, but it'll kill you in the long run, right? Yeah.
Right. But I mean, if we think about it, it's much cheaper for them to have Left come in, even with his Left. I don't know all your specialties. You have a lot of them, but it's cheaper to have Left come in and try to solve all of their problems, even if it's just generally saying, you know what, I'm not an expert here, but here's just a couple of general recommendations, than it is for Left to say, hey, you know what, we need to get Steven involved in this. We need to get Jay involved in this, right?
So maybe Joel, along that path, is the mindset we should be, and it's a struggle, but struggling to inculcate with the leaders that we work with is you're going to get, it's like you going shopping around for a bargain basement doctor, right? You're going to get what you pay for. And if if you really want the results, you have to not only pay for the results, but put in the work that goes along with it.
Right. So I think a lot of these leaders have this mindset of, and reasonably so, because we see the same thing in medical care when people don't have insurance, they're not covered by an entity, right? They say, okay, so you're going to ask me to spend God knows how much, like $100,000 for a hospital visit, and you're telling me that I actually have to do all the work? Like, what the hell, right? That's people's reactions, and rightfully so, right? So I mean, that kind of goes to some of the fundamental structures of how we work. Maybe one of the disrupting forces that'll be out there is the development of Agile insurance or something like that, but you see where I'm going with
Agile malpractice insurance. What a brilliant idea. Again, if anybody comes up with that, our lawyers will be in touch. So I want to, we're approaching time, but something just occurred to me that I want to throw out there and see if this adds a wrinkle of complexity. We keep using these, we use terms like illness, injury, disease, and all the examples we're given are basically physiological, right? Cancer, pulled shoulders, sprained elbows, knee replacements. Is there a difference if it's mind illness as opposed to musculoskeletal, neurological, like is it cluster B, cluster A, those sort of disorders? Does that change? Does that add a wrinkle to this metaphor? How much more complex does it make it?
So can I go out there for a minute? Are you guys willing to let me go out there? This may completely wreck my professional career from now until infinity. But one of the things that got me started thinking about this in general, and Jay, I think we've had this conversation before, is I've recognized in organizations that I work in the same symptoms at an organizational level as we see in somebody who is depressed or bipolar, right? And part of what helped me make this shift is seeing the same patterns operate across a large group of people as would operate in a single person that would be medically diagnosed, right? I have worked in organizations who are depressed, who have lost finding joy in the things that they used to find joy in, right? Who their productivity goes down, their desire to they find it more difficult to do things that they would normally do in the course of their day or their life. All of the symptoms of depression get checked off at an organizational level, So I think that that actually may be one of the most digestible ways to make the transition from organic to, or from mechanical to organic here, because these patterns are things that are already defined or already diagnosable and happen when a bunch of people's brains get together, right?
Right. Okay.
So I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit too out there, but
Stephen, thoughts, reactions?
I totally agree. I think it's actually easier to correlate it with mental, because mental illness can lead to physical harm, physical injury, physical ailments, right? So, or psychosomatic. What symptoms are we making up because we don't have health in our mind? So I think that it's, to me, it lends itself. It's a balance. I think you can have both. I think that it parallels and partners really well with both, physical and mental.
Stephen?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think just, depending on which portion of mental you're talking about, some of those can be helped with counseling. Some of those can be helped with medication for some period of time along with counseling. And some of those you're on meds for the rest of your life. And you still need to check in to see, are the meds still doing what they need to do? If not, do I need to tweak them some? How do I best tweak them? Let's tweak it and see if it works. So I think that all still fully applies.
Oh man, are we gonna have to develop inpatient care for companies?
Agile inpatient care. Yep. Again, our lawyers will be in touch if we see it pop
Wait,
up.
No. That's just a dojo, right?
Yeah, it is a dojo. So while you were saying that, I was thinking, while Lev was giving his elegant response to what you said, I was thinking to myself, okay, so what's the equivalent of Munchausen by proxy in an organization? And I know, when I answer my own question, I know what it is. It's when you hire the consultant and the consultant really doesn't fix the problem, but they keep telling you what the problem is so they can continuously be engaged and continuously be paid, instead of really putting the thing down and going, look, Mr. Leff, there's no easier way to tell you this, but buddy, your baby's ugly. The baby's ugly.
So you bring up a good point. Doctors at some point in time decide that patients are wasting their time if they're not going to accept the care, right? And doctors will say, you know what, I don't want to see you back here for another 6-8 months, a year, or when you come to your senses, right? If you're not going to do the things that I know you need to do, that you know that you need to do, I'm not going to treat you anymore, because I don't want you to sue me for malpractice when you're not doing what you're supposed to.
Right, which is the equivalent of a coach firing a customer.
Yeah,
or saying, "Look, you're not into it.
Yeah.
What am I actually doing here? What am I doing here?" Okay. All right, gents, well, we're at time. So I want to thank all of you for taking this metaphorical journey with us. I'm sure we definitely ruined someone's medical school training. I thank God no doctors listen to the show. We'd all be sued for malpractice. But on behalf of myself, I want to thank Joel, Andrew, and Stephen for hopping on to entertain this metaphorical conversation. On behalf of Joel, Stephen, Andrew, and myself, I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in once again. I hope you enjoyed it. Give us a like, a review, a listen on iTunes, Podbean, PodHub, your podcasting app of choice. If you like what you heard, why don't you leave a review? It helps others find us. Thank you and shout out to Krebs and Machine Man Records for the outro music, which is provided royalty-free. And last but not least, we are committed, the Agile Uprising, to always being free. However, we do have a Patreon. So if you feel like you wanted to defray some hosting and production costs, feel free to chip in. You may get a surprise in the mail. Maybe you'll get my last doctor's bill. So once again, until next time, I want to thank everybody. And this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.